So have you ever wondered what happens when the government just fails to act? When our basic rights are on the line and the whole system that's supposed to protect you just stalls? Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful and honestly controversial ideas in modern governance, judicial activism. Let's break down how it all works. All right, here's our game plan. We're going to start with the basic blueprint of how government is set up. Then, we'll look at what happens when that system hits a wall. We'll uncover the pretty radical tool the court came up with to jump in, see the very real impact it had through some huge cases, and then we'll get into the big question. Is this activism or is it overreach? Okay, so before we can even talk about a court being activist, we've got to understand how things are supposed to work. The Indian Constitution, just like a lot of democracies, is built on this really fundamental idea called the separation of powers. It's actually a pretty simple but brilliant design. You have the legislature, that's parliament, and their job is to make the laws. Then you have the executive, which is the government of the day, and they're tasked with enforcing those laws. And finally, you've got the judiciary, the court system. Their job is to interpret the laws and basically act as a neutral referee. Everybody has their own lane, and they're supposed to stay in it. But here's the question that really changes everything. What happens when the legislature doesn't make the laws that are desperately needed? Or when the executive doesn't actually enforce the ones that already exist? What do you do when the whole system designed to protect people just breaks down? Well, that exact problem is what set the stage for one of the most incredible shifts in India's constitutional history. Because when this system stalled, the judiciary decided to step up. And in doing so, it created a whole new philosophy for itself. And that philosophy is what we call judicial activism. This is a huge shift away from the traditional idea of a judge being just a passive interpreter of the law. Instead, the court takes on this really proactive role. It decides to step in and protect people's rights and make sure justice is served, specifically because the other branches of government weren't doing their jobs. And the timing here is absolutely crucial. This wasn't just some abstract idea. It came out of a real crisis of faith. In the years after the emergency, in the late 70s and 80s, public trust in politicians was at an all-time low. People felt let down. So visionary judges like V.R. Krishna Iyer and P.N. Bhagavati started to see the courts as the last hope for the common person. But to really act on that, they needed a new tool. And the tool they came up with would completely change the game. It would revolutionize who could even get a foot in the door of a courtroom in India. It was simple, it was powerful, and it literally changed everything. It's called public interest litigation, or PIL, and this became the #1 weapon in the judicial activism arsenal. The idea was just groundbreaking. It meant you no longer had to be the person who was directly harmed to go to court. Now, any citizen who cared could file a case for people who were too poor or oppressed or marginalized to fight for their own rights. And this comparison just perfectly captures the change. The old rule was this rigid legal thing called locus standi, which basically meant you had to prove you had a personal stake in the outcome. But with PIL, the Supreme Court just blew that wide open. They relaxed the rule completely. The focus was no longer on an individual's right to sue, it was about the public's right to get justice. I mean, this is just incredible to think about. The court didn't just bend the rules, it tore down the walls. The highest court in the entire country started treating simple letters, even postcards sent in by prisoners or activists, as formal legal petitions. All of a sudden, the Supreme Court wasn't some far-off, intimidating place. It was now within reach for absolutely everyone. So, the court has this powerful new tool. What did they actually do with it? Let's take a look at how this radical new idea started making real-world changes that affected millions and millions of lives. The results were immediate, and they were massive. You have the Husainara Khatun case, where a PIL brought attention to the thousands of under-trial prisoners rotting in jail. The court stepped in and declared a speedy trial to be a fundamental right, which led to the release of over 40,000 people. Then you have the MC Mehta cases, where a series of PILs forced the government to actually do something about cleaning up major rivers and tackling Delhi's air pollution. And in the famous Vishaka case, there was no law dealing with sexual harassment at work. So the court just stepped into what it called a legislative vacuum and wrote the rules itself, rules that became law across the entire country. But, maybe the biggest, most lasting legacy of this whole era was how the court completely redefined one of our core fundamental rights. It took Article 21, the right to life, and said, hey, life doesn't just mean being alive. It means having a life with human dignity. And that single reinterpretation opened up a floodgate of new rights. All of a sudden, the right to life also meant the right to a clean environment.
the right to earn a livelihood, the right to health, to education, and even, much more recently, the right to privacy. Now, none of these are spelled out explicitly in the Constitution this way, but the activist court just read them into Article 21, effectively making them fundamental rights that could be enforced.
Now, as you can probably imagine, not everyone was cheering. This huge expansion of judicial power kicked off one of the biggest and most important debates in Indian law. And it's one that's still going on today. Where do you draw the line between necessary activism and just plain judicial overreach? And this really gets us to the heart of the conflict. On one side, you have supporters who see activism as an essential tool for social justice. It's a way to hold the government accountable and to fill in the gaps when politicians just fail to act. But on the other side, you've got critics raising a major constitutional red flag. They're asking, doesn't this totally violate the separation of powers? They argue that judges, who are unelected and aren't accountable to the people, are wading into making policy, and that's a job for the legislature that we actually vote for. In more recent years, we've definitely seen a shift. The judiciary itself seems to be listening to these concerns. The trend now is much more towards a balancing act, something people often call judicial restraint. The idea is to intervene only when it's absolutely necessary, while being really careful to respect those constitutional lines drawn between the three branches of government.
And all of this leaves us with a final, really fundamental question. When it comes down to protecting our most basic rights, who do we really trust more? The officials that we elect to go and represent us, or the judges who are appointed to interpret the law? That is the central tension of judicial activism, and it's a question that every single democracy has to keep asking itself.